your career started off as a traditional mainstream biochemist. Did you always think materialism wasn't a sufficient explanation, or was there a particular moment where you decided that there was more to the story than materialism?
Well, when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge doing natural sciences, I began to have terrible doubts about materialism, not for religious reasons, because at that stage I identified as an atheist, having been converted to atheism by my science teachers at school. And I thought science equals atheism and materialism. Just swallowed the whole package. But what I found was that when I was an undergraduate, what disturbed me was the fact that I'd gone into doing biology because I actually liked animals. I kept lots of pets as a child, and I was interested in plants. My father was a herbalist and a pharmacist, and he taught me about plants. And I was genuinely really interested. I really wanted to be a biologist. And then I noticed that the first thing we did was to kill everything we were studying and grind it up. And I began to feel that, the things that really interested me were just nowhere there in biology as it was being taught. I was interested in how pigeons home, for example, because I kept pigeons as a child. But by the time you've sort of killed a pigeon and cut out its liver and ground it up and centrifuged it and isolated a few enzymes, you're nowhere near homing behavior. So that it was the reductionist aspect that upset me. And then I came across the writings of Goethe. And that for me was the first inkling that another kind of science was possible, and a holistic kind of science. And that preoccupied me, the idea, do I really want to do science? I mean, I'd never questioned it before, but if my whole career is just going to be killing animals and cutting things up and trying to reduce life to enzymes and DNA and things, is that what I want to do? And I wondered how it had got to be like that, and which is, then I had this chance to go to Harvard for a year. I got a scholarship, a fellowship, in fact, in the graduate school, to do history and philosophy of science. So I wanted to step back and get a bigger picture. And then when I went back to Cambridge, I did decide I wanted to do a PhD. I did it on plants, not animals, because I didn't want to spend the rest of my career cutting up animals and killing them. And so although I was doing mechanistic type research, I was always trying to find a bigger picture right from the minute I started my PhD. But I was still working within the mechanistic framework. But when I was at Harvard, I was there from 1963 to 4. And Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, came out in 62. So it was new, and it was a fresh idea. Most people hadn't heard of Kuhn then. And I read this book avidly and realized science could be different. This doctrine we've got at the moment, materialism, mechanistic materialism, isn't the truth. It's just a set of assumptions.
Right. So
I started looking for something broader quite early on.
Out of interest, I suppose Timothy Leary wasn't at Harvard at that time. He'd already been kicked out, had he?
Well, it was more or less when he was being kicked out. If he hadn't been kicked out, I would have volunteered for some of their research studies. It was just that was just happening at the time, or had just happened.
Right. So, as you were looking for this more kind of holistic science, at what point did you find a rich tradition, or was it, when you went looking for it, what kind of tradition did you see yourself as working in?
Well, to start with, I saw myself as working within the sort of biochemical cell biology tradition. But when I was doing my research for my PhD, I was working on how the plant hormone auxin is produced. Right. Auxin is chemically indole acetic acid. It's a breakdown product of the amino acid tryptophan. It's closely related to tryptamine and 5-hydroxytryptamine, serotonin. and indeed DMT, dimethyltryptamine. I hadn't heard of dimethyltryptamine at that time, but I was working on the biochemistry of hormone production. And what I discovered as part of my PhD research was that this hormone was produced by dying cells, that cells within the plant, as the proteins break down, the amino acids are released, and as they break down, auxin is produced as a fairly non-specific breakdown product of cell death, not just in plants, but in humans, animals, rats, etc., yeast. And because I was very influenced by Goethe, that really intrigued me, the idea that death within the organism produces more life. And the dying cells are the wood cells in the veins of leaves, in the shoot tips, in the thickening trunks of trees. The xylem cells, the wood cells, are dead, empty tubes that conduct water. So as those cells form, they thicken up the walls, and then the cell commits suicide, dissolves itself, and in so doing releases this hormone that promotes more growth. So that I found a satisfying way of putting a biochemical investigation into a bigger picture.
Yeah.
It still was about, I could publish the results in conventional biochemistry and botany journals because it wasn't outrageously beyond the paradigm, but it brought in a bigger picture. And then after my PhD, I had a research fellowship and then a fellowship at Clare College, Cambridge. And I went on working on auxin, but then on the polar transport system, how it's moved from the shoots towards the roots. And again, I was looking at the very basis of polarity in plants. Why are things polar? The polarity of roots and shoots. And looking at the molecular basis of polarity. And that was probably my most influential contribution. It's now a key part of standard developmental biology, the discoveries I made with a colleague at Cambridge on the polar transport system. This hormone's moved only towards the roots, not in the opposite direction. I also, in 1968, spent a year at the University of Malaya working on rainforest plants. And I traveled in India and Southeast Asia. And that was an eye-opening experience for me. So all of these things were putting what was still conventional research into a larger framework.
And was it when you were traveling in India that you became interested in spirituality?
Yes, I mean, I was thrown into a culture which I was completely unprepared for through my scientific and rather conventional education in England. And I was fascinated by temples, holy men, cannabis. So, I mean, I discovered cannabis when I was in India with a holy man in the Himalayas. I mean,
you were how old at this point?
It's B68. I was 26.
And this was in 1968?
Yes.
So at that point, were there beginning to be more Westerners traveling around India?
Oh, yes, that was the peak of the kind of hippie trail to India. That's when, the Beatles had just been to the Maharishi. And then you could travel overland. Lots of people, I didn't do that, but lots of people traveled overland in Volkswagen buses, through Persia and Afghanistan and stuff. You could still do that then.
Yes, yes.
And so India was full of hippies hanging out with holy men. And then I was in Sri Lanka. I visited a Buddhist monastery and met a Buddhist monk who explained about meditation, and I was fascinated by that. In Malaysia, I was among Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, also in that wonderfully rich tropical forest. So this certainly opened my eyes. When I got back to Cambridge, then I encountered LSD. So psychedelics enlarged my view of the mind.
And how did you encounter psychedelics?
Well, through a friend who'd taken LSD and said this is amazing, and so he took it with me, and so I had someone with me to help who were more experienced than me. And that was a very, very life-changing experience.
Was Cambridge at that time quite psychedelic?
I think I took the LSD about 1970 or 71. yes, I mean, there were quite a lot of people interested in psychedelics at that time. You know, it was Leary and all, I mean, 68 psychedelics were everywhere. You know, it was the summer of love, and San Francisco.
I sometimes wonder, to what extent were people taking psychedelics, and to what extent was it just still a kind of, you know, a small handful of people? I mean, my parents were at Cambridge in like 71. They definitely weren't doing psychedelics. So
well, it was a small handful. I mean, it wasn't sort of the mainstream. There were still lots of people just doing rowing and rugby and stuff, as there still are. And there were people who weren't interested in that sort of thing. But there was a definite hippie type element, a subculture mainly among undergraduates and graduate students. Right. And I was a junior don at the time, and I was probably the only fellow of my college who was into psychedelic.
So then you started to bring these worlds together. At what point did you think you could bring your scientific training to the world of spirituality? And who were the inspirations for that? I mean, were there people whose work you looked and think, oh, I could do work in this area?
Well, as a result of taking LSD around about 1971, I took up transcendental meditation. There was a center in Cambridge where you could learn to meditate. And I'd been to India, I'd met gurus, I'd met this Buddhist monk in Sri Lanka, I knew people who meditated in Malaysia, and I was interested in the nature of consciousness. That was partly through cannabis in India and LSD. And then I wanted to explore consciousness without drugs, you know, through meditation, another way of doing it. And the way the transcendental meditation people promoted it at that time, so 71 or something, was by saying, you don't have to believe anything to do this, you just do it, and it affects your blood pressure and your lactic acid levels in the blood, and it's physiological and stuff. They very much promoted it as something with a kind of scientific basis. That was before the main studies on physiology of meditation began. Then at Harvard it was around 1974, but he was actually taking up where the transcendental meditation people had already got to. I mean, he made it official, but they were already doing this kind of study. So I think really through these studies on meditation, and of course, psychedelics themselves have a scientific basis. LSD is a chemical compound and obviously is acting on the brain through neurotransmitter sites. I mean, it's not, so that automatically brings together the realms of science and at least conscious experience.
When did you first try DMT?
Oh, I don't think I took DMT till much later. That was when I was at the Esalen Institute in the 1980s with Terence McKenna. I can't remember the exact year, but it would have been late 80s probably.
Yeah, okay.
And that was after I'd lived in India for 7 years. I visited India in 68, but then I went back there. I took a job there in 74. And I lived there on and off till 85.
Right. And at that point, that's when you met Bede Griffiths and went to stay at his ashram?
Well, I didn't at first. I went there to take up a sort of official job at a new International Crops Research Institute in Hyderabad called ICRISAT, the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics. And my job was as principal plant physiologist, doing research on the physiology of pigeon peas and chickpeas. So it was a high-powered international institute. I was called principal plant physiologist. It was an international research team. It was funded by the Ministry of Overseas Development, the World Bank, the Ford Foundation. I mean, it was sort of the only international institute in India. So this was not some kind of marginal thing. It was the most mainstream agricultural institute in South Asia, I would say. And there I had about 100 people working under me. And so it was a responsible job running a whole research program. which I very much enjoyed. And I loved the fact, the reason I wanted to do it was because, first of all, I wanted to live in India, because I got to the point where, I loved being in Cambridge, I loved being a fellow of a college, but as I looked at older dons, I could see if I just stayed doing this, I could see every stage in sort of decay ahead of me, in the narrowing of perspectives.
Like what, the descent of man, was it?
Yes. So, I just thought this is such a narrow, comfy, but narrow world, and it gets narrower the longer people stay here. And I just felt this isn't, and moreover, I was working in the biochemistry department, and my interests were by then going way beyond biochemistry. And so I felt, now I'd rather do something different, not just go on being an academic, because it seemed a restricted life, but I wanted to do something scientific and something useful. And so the idea of doing agriculture in India appealed to me, because I wanted to be in India. I found India very exciting. And agricultural research is potentially useful. And it's also intrinsically holistic. And you have to work with whole plants growing in fields, with farmers and with insect pests and with the rain and the monsoon and the climate. And you have to you can't just separate off a few enzymes in a laboratory. You're working in an intrinsically integrative way of working. And I was in a team with pathologists who looked at diseases, entomologists who looked at insect pests, breeders who were breeding new varieties, microbiologists who looked at the root nodules, agronomists exploring cropping systems. And I really enjoyed that integrative approach, and integrative through teamwork as well.
Right, yeah.
So anyway, I was doing that. I did that full time for 4 years. But I went on thinking, when I was in Cambridge, I came up with the idea of morphic resonance, memory and nature. In relation to my work on developmental biology, I came up with that idea as a way of trying to understand plant development. And I felt plants were inheriting their form in a way that wasn't just through the genes, but involved some direct transmission over time. But I realized it was heretical and provocative and dangerous as an idea. And I knew if I published it, it would be the end of my conventional career. So I couldn't publish it until I felt sure of myself. And I wanted to think about it, because I realized as soon as I came out with this in public, that would change everything for me. And I didn't know if I could substantiate it, whether there was enough evidence to make it credible, whether it was just a wild idea that wouldn't go anywhere. So all the time I was working in India, I was thinking about it. And, in my spare time, I was thinking about this idea and about form and about memory. And in India, thinking about a kind of memory in nature was not difficult, because it's part of Hindu philosophy, and Indians weren't shocked by the idea of memory in nature. In fact, the opposite. They just said, there's nothing new in this idea. Everyone's been saying this for thousands of years. They weren't very helpful when it came to working out the scientific details, but I was in a cultural environment where the basic idea seemed to most people like common sense. Whereas in Cambridge, it seemed like totally wild and off the wall. So anyway, I got to the point where I felt I could write this up as a book. And so I resigned my post and needed somewhere to live in India. I wanted to write it in India. And by that stage, a friend had told me about Father Bede Griffiths and his ashram. And I'd been to visit him, and I absolutely loved the ashram, small, simple, on the bank of a sacred river in Tamil Nadu in South India. Father Bede was a very, very inspiring and magical figure in his orange robes with his white beard and long white hair. And when I told him I wanted to write this book, and I told him about my situation, he said, well, if you want to, come live here. You can live as long as you like, and we'll give you a hut, and you can be part of the community, and you can write your book. And so I did that, and went and lived in a palm-thatched hut under a banyan tree in this ashram, and was part of the communal life. And as well as providing a place to write and think, Father Bede was a very inspiring teacher because he brought together Indian philosophical traditions and the deeper mystical aspects of Christian theology. He introduced me to Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, Aristotle's theories of form. I had an education in mystical European theology, particularly medieval theology, as well as in Indian philosophy from Father Bede, which was very helpful in developing the ideas that I wrote about in my first book, A New Science of Life, which is dedicated to Father Bede and which came out in 1981.
You also did some work at the, sometimes maybe you just use the library, but in the Theosophical Society's headquarters in Chennai.
Yes.
What's your relationship to Theosophy and what do you think of it?
Well, when I went to from Hyderabad to Father Bede's ashram in Tamil Nadu, I used to stay in Madras on the way, Chennai. And I soon discovered that by far the nicest place to stay in Madras is the Theosophical Society. Chennai is now much more crowded than it was then. But even then, it was a very crowded city. And here was this campus, I don't know, 50 acres of gardens and banyan trees and, and beautiful buildings and places you could stay and a well-equipped library. And I found this was the perfect place to be. And the library was the best library I'd found in India for philosophical subjects, covering religious philosophy, theology, Western philosophy, Eastern philosophy, esoteric philosophy. It was very comprehensive. And so I joined the Theosophical Society, I have to say, largely because they made it easy to stay there if you were a member and hard if you weren't, because everyone wanted to stay there.
And have you ever dipped your toe into Theosophy or read?
Oh yes, there were courses going on there, on the.
And what do you make of it?
Well, I think it's a pioneering attempt to synthesize Eastern and Western philosophies, and I think I'm not so keen on Madame Blavatsky, but I read a lot of books by Ledbetter and Annie Besant, which I liked very much, and I found that their attempt to bring together the Eastern and Western spiritual and philosophical traditions was very pioneering, extremely helpful, and just the kind of thing I was interested in, that Father Bede was interested in too.
Yeah.
I found that the approach of the Theosophists was rather intellectual, though. I mean, it was that here we've got this grand synthesis. We see the truth behind all religions. And here on the campus in the Theosophical Society is a little chapel, that's the Christian tradition, a little mosque, the Muslim tradition, a little temple, Hindu tradition, a little Buddhist shrine, the Buddhist tradition. But Theosophy has risen above all these traditions. It includes them all, but it's like an umbrella that includes all these things in this overarching synthesis. Well, I'm in favor of overarching syntheses, but there was something lost by having something so rather abstract and superior to everything else.
Yes.
And what I found much more satisfying was when I was living in Father Bede's ashram, there was still this integrative activity, but not the idea of risen above actual religion and tradition, but still rooted in a regular religious practice. The praying 5 times a day, chanting in the morning and the evening. Every morning we chanted the Gayatri mantra, and there was an hour of yoga, 2 hours of meditation every day, and living as a community. And I just found that much more anchoring, much more rooted than this rather, quite a number of people at the Theosophical Society tended to have a very superior attitude to religions, We've seen through all the details, the dogmas, this is the truth, and so. So I found that a bit off-putting.
Right.
And I still do. I mean, I give talks at the Theosophical Society. I've been to in London and in Wheaton, Illinois, and stuff. And I find, I have friends who are Theosophists, and they've always been much more open to holistic science than anyone else. So I think that it's done a great deal to open up Western traditions to Indian thought and to bring Indian ideas into the mainstream. I mean, they were doing this in the 1890s, and it really wasn't until the 1960s that meditation and things took off at a popular level.
Yes.
But Theosophists had pioneered all this, and things like cremation, which didn't happen before. So they were pioneering movement. And so I think they've done great work and continue to do great work.
In terms of your last book, Science and Spiritual Practices, it explored a field which I very much relate to, of, I suppose, like scientific spirituality or empirical spirituality, the attempt to bring these two worlds together, the attempt to kind of, in some ways, have a kind of evidence-based spirituality of some sort. And I think of you as perhaps the leading British representative of that tradition. Do you think of that as a kind of historical tradition? And do you think of yourself as consciously working within that tradition? And if so, who do you see as the kind of pioneers in that tradition?
Well, first, actually, my latest book is Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, which is the sequel to Science and Spiritual Practices. So there's two books, and each dealing with 7 different spiritual practices. Well, I think that part of the precursors of this approach are the mystics themselves and the yogis in India, because after all, the mystics were carrying out, they were quite disciplined meditative practices, things like fasting, and yogis, through pranayama and breathing exercises and yoga. These are bodily, empirical things. These aren't vague abstractions. These are practices that have within India, for years people have been looking at physiology of yogis and how they can slow down their heartbeat and reduce their blood pressure, even survive buried underground for days and things. So already in India there was a tradition of investigation of these remarkable yogic feats, because after all, they're physiologically measurable, the effects. It wasn't some vague abstract thing about, it makes me feel good. It was, these are very definite things. And I think that the scientific studies of psychedelics, of the kind that Stan Groff and Alpert and Leary and others were conducting in the 60s and 70s, were precursors of this. I think that the people who studied near-death experiences, starting with Raymond Moody and a whole lot of other people since then, again in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and people looking into, more recently, into lucid dreams and things like that, which now has come into the field of consciousness studies, which now is a kind of academic discipline. These were all strands that fed into it, and in all of which I was interested. And I've also had a long interest in psychical research, telepathy and premonitions and things. Not because I think psychical research is intrinsically spiritual. I think psychic phenomena are to do with interlinking between organisms and each other, and with the environment. And they're about survival, basically, and social relations, not about another dimension or the beyond, which is, I think, the realm of the spiritual, or at least the beyond the mundane. I mean, most telepathic things, dogs knowing when their owners are coming home, mothers knowing when their baby needs feeding if it's out of earshot, and they feel their breasts tinkle, their milk lets down. These are simple, everyday survival type phenomena. They're not weird or spooky, and they're normal and natural and not paranormal or supernatural. Anyway, that area of research too has always interested me.
Mm.
And of course, that's very taboo within mainstream academia because it goes against the materialist dogma that the mind's nothing but the brain.
Yeah.
Mental activity is brain activity. So in terms of an older history of interest in these things, I suppose the philosopher that most interested me in this respect was Schopenhauer, because Schopenhauer, writing around the beginning of the 19th century, was integrating Eastern philosophy, particularly Hindu philosophy, with Western philosophy in a very interesting way. And Schopenhauer writes very clearly. And I don't share his pessimistic worldview, but Schopenhauer was already producing this integration of Eastern and Western thought. And of course, Goethe and that school in Germany, which is the romantic school of science, of Naturphilosophie, had been one of my earliest influences, as I've already mentioned, when I came across Goethe's writings at Cambridge. And again, that wasn't exactly spiritual, but it was sort of holistic and trying to see how things are interconnected, how the natural world is a web of interconnections, rather than being reductively materialist.
Right, okay. So I'm looking partly at the Huxley family and how they helped to, I suppose, reinvent religion and spirituality after Charles Darwin. So I'm looking at Thomas Huxley and his work with Darwin, and then Julian and Aldous and both their kind of visions and how they relate, and Francis as well. What do you think of first of all, the Huxley brothers of Julian and Aldous, and how important do you think they are to this tradition of scientific spirituality?
Well, of course, they were very different. I mean, Julian Huxley was pretty committed to a fairly conventional scientific, somewhat materialist view, but because he was a leading humanist, he was basically in the tradition of trying to make humanity into God. You know, humanism is basically like Christianity, except replaces God with humans. And so I came across him first when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge, when I joined the Cambridge Humanist Society, and I went to talks. I went to one by Sir Julian himself. Right. I must have been about 19 at the time. And I soon found secular humanism rather dreary, and most of the secular humanists I met were rather dreary. And they spent a lot of their time making sort of rather worn-out jokes against religion. I mean, they were very sort of anti-religious, arrogant, because they thought, you know, humans and science has now explained everything, and only stupid people believe in religion, whereas we can chart the way forward to a new future run by science and scientists as the new priesthood. So basically, it was the idea of replacing a religious priesthood with a scientific priesthood. Yeah. With Sir Julian Huxley, like the kind of archbishop of biology. And he approved of Teilhard de Chardin's writings largely because he thought they provided could provide an alliance with what he saw as evolutionary humanism. Humans taking evolution under their own control and the ultimate becoming like gods through. So that was in the tradition of what I'd say, you know, in the Soviet or in Russia before the Soviet period, the God makers, you know, which actually grows out of the Eastern Orthodox Church tradition of theosis, that the purpose of human life is to become divine. That Jesus became human so that humans could become divine. Right. I mean, it's a very key part of Orthodox spirituality. But when secularized into the Russian doctrine of God-making, it then became a kind of secular humanist, Enlightenment-inspired project for the transformation of humanity. So Sir Julian was very much in that tradition. And I myself, because I already had grave doubts about mechanistic science, and also I found the kind of humanist arrogance deeply unappealing. And I mean, lack of interest in spirituality or mystical experience. I mean, an adulation of reductionist science. I mean, so I wasn't very drawn to that. But curiously, when I got married to my wife Jill and moved to Hampstead, which was in 1985, she already knew Francis Huxley, Sir Julian's son, who lived in Hampstead. And through Francis, I met his mother, Lady Huxley, and Juliet. And Juliet was Swiss by origin. And I became very friendly with Juliet. She lives near us, about, in Pond Street, round the corner from where I am. And by that time, our older son, Merlin, had been born. He was about a year old. And my wife, Jill, taught a lot of workshops and still does, except they're on hold at the moment. So I spent a lot of time looking after the baby. And there's not that many things you can do with a 1-year-old, but Juliet was a governess to start with at Garsington, for Lady Otterl and Morel. And she had great-grandchildren and was very, very good with children. She liked young children, had little toys for them. And she and I got on very well. So I used to go around quite often, weekly or fortnightly,
right,
for tea with Juliet. And then in the summer, Merlin would play in the garden. And I used to carry him there on my shoulders. And she loved the fact I carried him there, and I used to arrive and ring the bell with a young child on my shoulders. And in fact, when she died, she left me a picture by Keith Vaughan of a man with a child on his shoulders, because this was an image she so enjoyed, me showing up with a child on my shoulders.
Right.
So I got to know Juliet quite well, and so I got a whole other take on Sir Julian from her.
What was she?
And he was a terrible husband.
So carry on.
What was she like?
Well, what was she like, and what did she say about Sir Julian?
Well, I think she had a very hard time with him because he was constantly unfaithful. He had mistresses and felt that he had every right to, and that why should he obey any of these bourgeois restrictions on fidelity, etc. He was not only unfaithful, but sort of self-righteous about it.
Yes.
So I think she had to put up with a great deal from him. And she lived till she was about 95. And in fact, we visited her. Our children both knew her quite well. And she was like a grandmother to them. And so I once said to her, "Oh, Juliet, are you afraid of dying?"
Yeah.
And she said, "Yes." She said, "That's one reason I want to stay alive as long as possible." I said, "Are you afraid that, when you die, everything will just go blank?" She said, "No, I'm afraid that when I die, I'll survive and I'll have to meet Julian again."
Wow.
So she was rather sad that she was afraid of dying because she did believe in life after death. And
I didn't want to spend it with Julian.
She was, yes. So it was very sad, really. Anyway, so Juliet was lovely. I really liked her, and she was amusing and witty and good company and skittish, and so I knew she was one of the Huxleys I knew best. I never met Aldous. But Aldous had a big influence on me. When I was about 17, I read The Doors of Perception by Aldous, which got me very interested in mescaline and altered states of consciousness. And I read quite a few books by Aldous Huxley, and his ideas on the perennial philosophy, his openness to both science and to the spiritual dimension, I found really helpful. I mean, he was one of the most attractive intellectuals for me in terms of his books and writings.
Yeah.
And the fact he was scientifically well informed was very important for me. I mean, he's one of the few novelists who actually knew anything about science.
Right. Yes. Yes. So I suppose in terms of Julian's evolutionary humanism, there is, and I don't know if you've come across it in your travels around the New Age, let's call it, but there's a kind of evolutionary spirituality one sometimes comes across. You know, in people like Julian, people like Teilhard de Chardin, in Esalen, one can come across it, or in Sri Aurobindo. And there's an idea that a kind of new species of humanity, of like Homo Deus, as Yuval Harari called it, is emerging. And sometimes, and this is something that I've just been interested in my research in Julian, it can sometimes go with a slightly kind of tendency to eugenics, like the old species should pass away, or at least be discouraged to reproduce and so on. Have you encountered that kind of form of spirituality in your travels?
Oh yes. Well, I encountered the eugenic thing with Sir Julian in his talk in Cambridge, you know, where he talked about uplifting human race through selective breeding and eugenics.
Yeah.
Through sperm donors who were, you know, people exactly like himself. And indeed, I later found out he was a sperm donor. He put it into practice. And there are lots of people around today who are his children, whether they know it or not. So
do you think that was part of what he thought was his right to have all these affairs, that he had kind of super sperm, and, you know, he should...
I'm not sure that he had children with these women that he had affairs with. It might have been too inconvenient, or, you know, involved paternity payments or something, but
right.
or provoked a divorce or something. I don't know. I just don't know about that.
But he was donating sperm and kind of at the clinic in London where...
You know about him donating sperm, do you?
Well, I've heard about it, and I've looked into it, but because of the lockdown, I haven't been able to really do much thorough research. But I've heard that he was... I contacted a Canadian documentary maker who discovered his father, his biological father, had run a sperm donor clinic in London, one of the kind of leading clinics. And this scientist who ran the clinic, it turned out, had fathered tens, if not hundreds, of children. And he was in contact with Julian Huxley, as was one of Julian Huxley's students called Hermann Muller, who ran the famous, came up with the idea for the famous Nobel Prize sperm bank in California. And he wanted Julian Huxley to be on the board of that. So that's as far as I've got in my kind of research into it.
Oh, I see. Well, I know when I visited Francis in California, I don't know if I told you this or I told someone recently, but Francis, who ended his days in California in Sonoma County, he was married to an American woman, Adele, who's a friend of ours. We visited him there about 7 or 8 years ago, and Francis told me that he was getting letters from people who said they wanted him to give a sample of saliva for DNA tests because they'd been investigating that paternity, and under the changed rules where you can find out more about who your father is or origins, there were a whole series of people who writing to him saying they thought that they were conceived from sperm from his father, and they wanted a DNA test from Francis to see whether they were in fact Sir Julian Huxley's children. And so I said to Francis, what do you do with that? He said, I just throw them in the waste paper basket. He said, the last thing I want is a whole lot of my father's children showing up on the doorstep, and, you know, all these conceived by his eugenic policy. I mean, Francis just didn't want to know. He was revolted by it all.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to ask you about Francis, but before I do, did you see, you know, this kind of, you know, evolutionary spirituality with the kind of slightly eugenic, or in Julian's case, quite explicitly eugenic undertones. Have you come across it elsewhere in your travels? I mean, in the New Age,
Oh yes, I
in
mean
California or.
Well, I mean, yes, I mean
I suppose
Michael Murphy.
Yeah, go on.
Michael Murphy, who started the Esalen Institute,
Mm.
who's a friend of mine, and
Yeah.
I've often been there and taught there.
Yeah.
Spent a year in the ashram of Sri Aurobindo, as you probably know.
Yeah.
And his book, The Future of the Body, which is his magnum opus, is about human evolution and how human potential is not just spiritual but bodily, which is why he's interested in the spiritual side of sports.
Yes.
In my new book, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, the first chapter is on the spiritual side of sports.
Yes.
And that's much influenced by Michael Murphy's approach.
But Murphy, I don't know, whether he doesn't seem to talk or write much about genetics or eugenics particularly.
No, I don't think Murphy is particularly into eugenics, but I have met people at Esalen who are, and I once met a very weird fellow who was completely into eugenics, and he had a laboratory where they were doing in vitro fertilization. I mean, artificial, for childless couples.
Yeah.
And he saw this as a wonderful business opportunity to advance the eugenic agenda, because you could test the various embryos, select the right ones, the ones that fit the bill.
Yeah.
And it was an explicitly, which he was actually doing. I found it chilling and scary to find that this was actually going on.
And he was also quite into spirituality as well.
Well, he had this vision of, humanity is surging forward to this whole new sort of evolutionary humanism, or even transhumanism, which then, sorry, there's some noise outside. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Okay, it's all right. Some transhumanism, which spills over in sort of Ray Kurzweil and those kind of people.
Yes.
Who want to prolong human life indefinitely.
Yeah.
That was, of course, part of Aurobindo's plan. He thought that death would be overcome.
Yes, I've just been reading a kind of biography of him and the mother, and how kind of shocked and appalled his disciples were when he died.
Yes, they didn't elect new ones to the board of trustees because they thought they were all going to become immortal. Yes. Then when he died, the mother thought she was going to become immortal. And when she died, the other ones thought they were going to become immortal. And
nothing if not optimistic.
Yes, well, it led to chaos. I mean, because Pondicherry and the ashram are a chaotic situation in Pondicherry because of this.
Right. Because they hadn't really thought through what happens after they die.
Well, because they thought they wouldn't. Yeah. And, when you go to Oroville, which I don't know if you've been there yet on your...
No, never been.
Well, Oroville was conceived of as the city of the future, the ideal city of the future. Mm. It's mostly lived in today by sort of eco-visionaries who live in thatched huts and are doing organic agriculture. Yeah. But the original plan is not that at all. It's a huge city with enormous boulevards and huge structures, including the Matrimandia, the Mother Temple.
Yes.
And there was going to be a huge international airport. This was going to be the center, the metropolis for the new era of humanity, where immortality would first be achieved. Yeah. And it would become like the world capital of the new humanity. It's a grandiose, indeed megalomaniac vision.
Yes, I mean, he's a complete megalomaniac, and he thought he'd kind of intervened in World War II. He thought he basically ran global historical events. And he was sounds like he was just a completely raging narcissist.
Well, it does sound like that. I mean, some of his teachings, I've read The Life Divine and read Sat Prem's book on him, which is quite interesting. Mm. And I've been there several times. But the vision, I mean, the conflicts in the community in Pondicherry and in Oroville are terrible, because there are some people there who have this grandiose vision of world domination, or at least world capital with huge airports and boulevards and things.
Yes.
And there are other people who are basically hippies who want to live a simple lifestyle.
Yes.
These are completely conflicting visions. So there's a terrible internal inconsistency.
Yes. And I suppose what one can see in this kind of New Age spirituality, and sometimes with some kind of evolutionary ideas in it as well, is this idea of kind of we are super beings. Quite a Nietzschean idea, and obviously Sri Aurobindo is quite into Nietzsche, but as were lots of people at that time. I suppose including the Huxleys were also quite elitist. I mean, both Aldous and Julian were quite elitist too. Do you? I mean, again, you as someone who's very, I suppose, had a bird's eye view of New Age culture, particularly in the kind of UK and the US and in California. Have you ever felt that there are aspects of that culture that could be quite elitist?
Oh, yes. It reminds me a bit of the Theosophists, the idea that we're superior to everyone else.
Yeah.
We've seen through dogmatic religion. We've seen through all this sort of narrow materialism as well. We've seen through dialectical materialism, the communist perversion of materialism. We've seen through, limited science. And we're emerging into this new vision of a new humanity. It's similar to Julian Huxley, the Theosophists, where I first got a feel of this kind of superiority and elitist thing, and they equally look down on the uneducated masses and on traditionally religious people who they see as stupid, deluded, and narrow-minded, and dogmatic, caricature them all as fundamentalists and so forth.
You can see that in the kind of 20s, because they were modernists and they were quite snobbish. But do you just one still find it in the kind of after the 60s and in the kind of 70s, 80s and 90s and so on?
Oh, yes. I mean, the New Age movement has this kind of elitist quality. We've seen through. They're generally speaking anti-religious. You can learn from religious traditions, meditation, psychedelic shamanism, that sort of thing. But just as Theosophists thought they could learn a bit from Sufism and Buddhism and that sort of thing, but making it into their own humanist vision. And I would say that's very common. And I mean, I'm a practicing Anglican, as you know, and because I'm a Christian, I find that, one reason I'm a Christian is because I just don't like that kind of superiority. We've risen above all this. I feel, for me, being part of a tradition, going to my local parish church, meeting people in the local community who help the homeless and who run food banks and who actually get their hands dirty doing good works, and with wonderful music and the sense of continuity and liturgical tradition and the liturgical year. All of that I find really anchoring and rooting. But I find almost everyone in the New Age movement can't see the point. They just think, why on earth you want to do something that's just based on dogma and stuff? Well, actually, when you go to Hampstead Parish Church or any other parish church I go to in England, or cathedral, these aren't narrow-minded people who've been browbeaten into accepting ancient dogmas. I mean, anyone who goes to church today in Britain knows they're in a tiny minority of less than 5%. They're choosing to go. They know they don't have to, and they're choosing to go because they see a value in this tradition. And so the caricatures that I meet of religious traditions among New Age people are not very different from the caricatures I meet among militant atheists and committed materialists. They have the same kind of rejection of tradition.
And I think it's, you can see that in the kind of generation of Aldous Huxley, who were extremely, and the kind of Bloomsbury group as well, who were extremely influenced by kind of things like Nietzsche, and they reject institutions. They're all just dead and spiritually dead, and they reject Christian ideas of charity in that kind of Nietzschean way. And that's still a weakness of the New Age, isn't it? It's institutionally weak, and it often doesn't have enough sense of kind of rolling up your sleeves and helping the people at the bottom of society.
Well, it's hyper-individualist, and attempts to form communes have usually failed. So it's very individualist. It's a kind of pick and mix of spirituality. It's like going to a supermarket and a bit of Tibetan meditation here and sort of shamanic dream catcher there, and it's maybe an icon of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and some kahuna from southwest of the United States. It's a kind of pick and mix consumerist spirituality, to my view, extremely individualist. Yes. And when you get that Nietzschean thing, it sort of blends over into the kind of Ayn Rand, Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged, that kind of hyper-individualist Nietzschean view, which influences a lot of tech, Silicon Valley.
Yeah, that's where my research is ending up, at kind of looking at kind of Silicon Valley spirituality.
Yes, well, that because Silicon Valley is near Esalen, and there's always been a coming and going. Whenever I've given workshops at Esalen, there've always been people there from Silicon Valley, and it's led to me giving seminars at Google and at Microsoft, and I've given seminars in some of these high-tech firms, largely because of connections through Esalen. Right. The other thing Esalen does is connects in with Hollywood. A lot of people go there from Hollywood. And so it feeds into the whole media industry and the film industry. Yeah. So it plays a crucial role, actually, as a center which works into the general culture, both through Silicon Valley and through Hollywood, and through billionaires who can afford to fund research and fund all sorts of activities through philanthropic funding, which shapes the course of the direction in which our culture is going.
Yeah.
It's very influential.
Yes. So you definitely, I think one sees that kind of God-man philosophy in Silicon Valley still. When you've made billions within a few years, it's quite easy to be attracted to philosophies of, yes, we are a new species.
Yes, and especially feeling that if you're that rich, then you can make anything happen. The sky's the limit, and anything's possible. And anything is possible if you've got that kind of money, And Jeffrey Epstein is an example of someone who obviously felt he was amoral. He could do what he wanted, and for years he did what he wanted, and he had the rich and the famous and the influential eating out of his hand.
Yes, and he was
until he came up against the legal process, and but most people
he was a transhumanist. He was very interested in eugenics and so forth.
Yes, well, he's a perfect example of someone in that kind of framework, that way of thinking.
Yeah.
And I mean, he was caught out in the end. Not all of them are paedophiles, so not all of them would run that risk, that particular risk of exposure and disgrace. But I think that Peter Thiel is another person who's who I've actually met, and it's a kind of transhumanist. We can take control. We can do,
And there's also something quite Huxleyan about we can retreat to an island utopia, which obviously Epstein did, and Peter Thiel and his followers want to create these kinds of seasteading islands. And
he's gone to New Zealand for the time. He's got a base in New Zealand. That's their default option if they haven't got an actual island.
They've picked well, haven't they, for the pandemic?
Yes, well, exactly. That's part of it, you see. And I don't know if you know that book by John Gray, The Immortalization Commission.
I haven't read it yet, but I know it covers kind of Frederick Myers, who I'm very interested in.
Well, yes, but the most interesting thing in the Immortalization Commission, I like Gray's writings a lot, although he's an atheist. He's a kind of mystical atheist, and he sees through a lot of this stuff better than most and more clearly than most.
Right.
But the Immortalization Commission is really about the early part of the Soviet Union, when Bolshevik philosophy was heavily influenced by the God-making movement.
Right.
And they thought that through science and Soviet reform of society, humans would become immortal.
Mm.
And so when Lenin died, the head of the Soviet government set up an Immortalization Commission that, since Lenin had died and hasn't become immortal, they then wanted to preserve his body as well as they could, hence the mausoleum and the preservation stuff, so that when it became possible to resuscitate people, Lenin would be the first of this new race of immortalized humanity. And then, of course, his tomb became a kind of pilgrimage shrine for communists, just like Orthodox go to the shrines of saints. The communists went to the shrine of Lenin and still do. But that's particularly interesting because this whole movement was an important part of early Bolshevik philosophy as well. Right. John Gray's short book, The Immortalization Commission, tells this story and the philosophical background to it.
Yes, okay.
And of course, cryopreservation is the preferred method now for millionaires.
Yes, yeah. Have you ever read about a Nobel Prize-winning French surgeon called Alexis Carrel?
Carrel,
yes. He worked with the pilot Charles Lindbergh to develop a means to keep organs from decomposing outside of bodies, thereby making transplants possible. But he was also a kind of early transhumanist in the 30s, and they were trying to, how can they make people able to live forever? But they were kind of very into early human potential. They're very into developing human potential. They're into psychical research as well. But they were also quite fascist. He ended up setting up an institute in Vichy, France, and Lindbergh as well was a real supporter of the Nazis. So he's another person I've been looking at in terms of this kind of evolutionary spirituality and its sometimes tendency to authoritarianism.
I think it often goes that way. I mean, it is sort of Nietzschean and often fascistic. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you've looked at the more benign forms of this. I mean, Teilhard de Chardin is a more benign form of evolutionary because it's within a more spiritual framework. Yeah. And Thomas Berry, I'm reading a biography of Thomas Berry's at the moment. Do you know who I mean by Thomas Berry?
I've heard about him in relation to, I think, deep ecology, is it?
Yes. I mean, he was very influenced by Teilhard. He was a Roman Catholic, a Passionist father, I think. But he was very in that ecological, holistic, inspirational world. And he was not an arrogant man, and he did care about the poor, and he did. So he's like the benign side of that, the kind of still Christian form of a widely interpreted Christian form in the Teilhard tradition.
Okay, good. Well, I will definitely.
And maybe Matthew Fox would fit in that tradition too. He's a great friend of mine, and we've done several books together. I don't know if you've read any of his stuff, but.
Not yet, but he is trying to bring evolution and spirituality together in a humane way, is he?
Yes, and environmentalism, yes.
Yeah, yes, okay.
I mean, he wrote a book called Original Blessing, where he shows that the Christian tradition and the Judeo-Christian tradition is much more about, as in Genesis, God says it is good in the creation story, rather than a theology of fall and redemption. Actually, it's a celebration of the divine presence in creation. And he's just come out with a book called The Tower of Thomas Aquinas, which is very radical. Well, not radical because it's all there in Thomas. It's about the kind of living nature side of medieval Christianity. And he's also he had a university called the Creation Spirituality University in Oakland, California. And so he's another pole of this Californian movement, but a kind of Christian pole. He started a thing called the Cosmic Mass, which happens at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. And the Cosmic Mass is a celebration of the cosmos and the creation, our part in this larger whole, our part in the unfolding divine process. But it's still rooted in a religious tradition, which always brings with it a kind of humility, which you don't find in the transhumanist people who've cut themselves off from any restraints on their egotism and narcissism.
Right. I'd like to ask you about two last things. Well, firstly, I would, we must talk about Francis Huxley, because you knew him well and he was a friend of yours. So there's we can just learn a lot from you about him. And then just finally about your thoughts about the pandemic and how it might affect us, and whether it creates this space for perhaps some kind of positive aspects that might come from it spiritually. So first of all, about Francis, tell me about, did you meet Francis then through Juliet, and tell us a bit about...
No, through my wife, Jill, who had lived in Hampstead for quite a while before we were married, and I moved here myself.
Yeah.
And Francis at that stage was mainly involved with R.D. Laing and the Philadelphia Association.
Right.
A kind of psychotherapeutic communities and things. Yeah. But his background, of course, was in anthropology.
Yeah.
A very amusing raconteur. And I think he identified more with Aldous than with his father. He had a very bad relationship with his father, Julian.
Julian was not a great father then?
No. No, I can't tell you exactly why he wasn't, but certainly Francis, found his father arrogant, dismissive, and whereas he found his uncle Julian, Aldous, much more inspiring and influential. So his work in anthropology, his interest in psychedelics, his interest in, the therapeutic communities,
and he in his work as an anthropologist, he was studying shamans. He was studying in living with indigenous communities.
Yes, in the Amazon and in Brazil and in Haiti. And he studied voodoo in Haiti as an anthropologist.
Wow.
And he lived with indigenous communities in Brazil. Mm-hmm. Which he wrote about in his book, Affable Savages. So then he was involved with FUNAI, or whatever it's called, the Survival International, helping to protect indigenous people.
Right.
That was his anthropological activities.
Yeah. What ideas did you find interesting of his? I mean, what do you think? What was his greatest impact of his life? Was it his work with R.D. Laing, or his work with Jeremy Narby on shamans, or with his work on psychedelics?
I don't think he ever found a totally central focus for his life. I mean, he worked in different areas, but unlike Aldous, there wasn't a kind of consistent thread. So, his books on anthropology, about anthropology, he was also interested in Lewis Carroll. And he wrote a book called The Raven and the Writing Desk, which is a scholarly book about Lewis Carroll's mathematical puzzles and fascination with the number 42. So he'd spent a lot of time in what I thought of as rather inconsequential scholarship, with extraordinarily obscure details of Lewis Carroll's speculations. So some of his work seemed to me just obscure, willfully obscure, dealing with extraordinarily, and I couldn't see the relevance to anything very much. And his unfinished project, I think possibly his big vision, which he never completed, was to write a book called The Mutual Self, about how our consciousness is shaped by our interactions. So it was a kind of holistic, interactive view. But I think he was rather disgusted by his father's, rather fascistic visions, or at least megalomaniac or grandiose visions. And that may be one reason why he chose to go and work with hunter-gatherers in the Amazon. Or
right. I mean, you can't see Julian Huxley doing that. Even though he was president of UNESCO, he didn't really have, much interest in non-Western culture.
No, because that was primitive and Western culture was leading the way through science.
Yeah.
Whereas Francis's a kind of rebellion against that was to leave Western culture and science behind. He had a rather skeptical view about, mechanistic materialism. I mean, he thought it was very limited and left out most of the interesting things about mythology and consciousness and the kind of shamanic perspective.
Do you think he helped to, I mean, obviously now we have a veneration for indigenous shaman in this culture. And people pay huge amounts of money to go and do ayahuasca retreats with shamans in the Amazon. Was he part of that shift in perspective, or?
No. No, I mean, he wasn't. He didn't have any illusions about, he thought some of the things they did were interesting and stuff. But the reality of his work in Haiti was that a great deal of it was about casting spells, voodoo and witchcraft.
Curses
and living within a kind of paranoid culture where whatever happens, somebody's done it to you and you've got to have a spell back against them. Yeah. And he'd sort of shudder with horror at the thought of just how nasty that world was. And, he looked on the dark side of things on the whole.
Right.
A lot of his stories and interests were about, things that were actually quite nasty, spells, nasty spells. And,
so he did not romanticize shamanism either of Haiti or of the Amazon?
No, very much not. I mean, I haven't actually read his book, Affable Savages, but I mean, he chuckled when he told stories about some of the people and the way they interacted and stuff. It wasn't all bad. I mean, there were nice people who did nice things, but it wasn't a romanticized vision.
Do you think he believed in magic, in the kind of, the shamans actually had the ability to curse people or harm people or help people?
Yes, I think he did.
Yes, and did he ever have any kind of run-ins himself with, dangerous shamans in his adventures?
I don't know. He never talked about them, as far as I remember. I mean, but he was well aware of the shadow side of shamanism. He was never taken in by this kind of starry-eyed glorification of shamanism.
And just finally, then, we're talking in the middle of this pandemic. You say that it's been quite a creative time for you for your work, and that in some ways perhaps you see some potential, amid all the suffering that it's causing, some potential positives out of this enforced pause that the human race is going through at the moment. Could you tell me a bit more about that and about your experience of the pandemic so far?
Well, I think there are a lot of positives, actually. I think we've all been forced to take a kind of sabbatical or going on a kind of retreat. And, a retreat is where you stop your normal activity. You have to do something else. And with more time for self-examination and thinking through about bigger questions and so on. And I think for many people, it's had that effect. And I think it could have a permanently transformative effect. I mean, I love leading a quiet life at home and doing more gardening than I've ever done before. And going for walks on Hampstead Heath and every day with my wife, which we've never done that before. I mean, I walk on the heath all the time, but she's taken up walking, and which she hadn't done before this, and it's a lovely thing to do. I've also had more time to think about things, read things, do a new research project. I'm putting scientifically ideas together, tying together some of my early work on plant development with the latest research that's going on today, and weaving together interests that have gone on over the years with time to do it and time to read without having to catch planes to go and give talks or go and address meetings or whatever, or go to committee meetings of the Heath Society or whatever. Just much more time, and love that, and more time for cooking. We're having delicious food, simple food, but absolutely delicious.
Right.
And because I walk on the Heath every day, I run into neighbours. It's quite social. I'm always meeting people. I know people I wouldn't normally have a chance to talk to. So at our socially distanced regulation, separation, we chat, and most people I know finding it a marvelous time for refreshment and regeneration, and also, of course, the collapse in air travel and reduction of carbon footprints very good for the environment. And so I, like many people, hope that it won't be back to business as usual. I hope that we'll have less travel, less busy lives, more cycling, more walking, more local activities.
You think it might, lead to kind of a slowdown of the frenetic pace and more of a contemplative life then? Yeah,
I hope so. I think that's really possible.
And what do you think the future of religion or spirituality might be? I mean, and let's just say just in the UK, I sometimes feel a bit outnumbered in the UK. If one's into spirituality, I sometimes feel like a bit on the margins of my culture, in terms of you don't see much on the BBC about spirituality. In fact, you hardly ever see anything about it, for example. But I don't know if you feel like that, or what do you think is potentially, how our culture might develop?
Well, I personally get the feeling there's a lot of interest in spirituality, but it's not reflected in the educational system or the media. You don't see much about it in The Guardian or the BBC. I think that's because the people who run these were people educated in the kind of humanist, materialist, atheist or agnostic tradition, and who think that to be educated is to be an atheist or an agnostic, and to see spirituality as sort of woo-woo and a bit soft-headed. I think that's still the kind of official assumption in these organs of the media. But I think when we look at what's actually happening in society, there are millions of people doing yoga. I mean, it's a mass industry now. I mean, even small towns have yoga centers. There are millions of people meditating. There are lots of people switching to vegan diets and thinking more about how they live in relation to the environment. There's tremendous interest in the revival of pilgrimage. This is something I'm involved in because I helped set up the British Pilgrimage Trust, which is now helping to reopen ancient footpath pilgrimage routes. And in fact, this year, interrupted by the pandemic, for the first time, there's been a launch of one-day pilgrimage routes to all our 42 cathedrals. And on the British Pilgrimage website, there's now well over 100 different routes, some of them to ancient hill forts and pre-Christian sites, some of them to holy wells. It's not all churches and cathedrals, although, of course, most of the holy places, for historical reasons, are Christian in England, or pre-Christian. I think that now people have got more used to walking and leading a quieter life. We could see a further growth of this kind of slow enjoyment of the countryside, walking with purpose, on pilgrimage. That's one of the things that's going on. But it has got a bit into the media, but it's sort of not the primary concern of the BBC or the Guardian, or the educational system. Yeah. But I think things are going to change, and I'm actually quite hopeful about it, because I think that there's nowhere left for materialism to go. I mean, it's fraying apart within science. The dogmas of materialism are no longer scientifically sustainable, although they've got a tremendous momentum and inertia. In my book, The Science Delusion, I show how these dogmas are, basically being superseded by science itself. So materialism as a philosophy, which is the underpinning philosophy for atheism for most people, which has always claimed the authority of science, can no longer really do that. It only does so if you're not very well informed, and most people aren't very well informed about science. But it's the carpet's been pulled from under its feet, really. So I think that if there's nowhere left to go with materialism except transhumanism and life extension pills and Ray Kurzweil and artificial intelligence taking over, I mean, that's the way evolutionary materialism is going and will continue to go, no doubt. But it's not something with a vast mass appeal. And therefore, I think that there's bound to be resurgence of interest in spirituality of various kinds, which is why I've written these 2 recent books on science and spiritual practices. And I myself think that since we come from a traditionally Christian culture or Judeo-Christian culture, that we have to come to terms with our own tradition. It's no use pretending it's not there or just rejecting it unthinkingly, because one takes over so many assumptions from something one rejects unthinkingly, often in a way that's not very healthy. So I myself think that a re-examination and a reconnection with the Christian tradition has to be a major part of this revival. Even if people decide they don't want to be Christian, at least not to just reject it when they're 14 years old and think, I've seen through it. All these people praying are just deluding themselves. They've been brainwashed by priests. The usual teenage reaction. I meet grown-up, otherwise intelligent people who are proud of this insight when they were 14 and have never moved on beyond it. And of course, I had that insight when I was 14 as well. But I think to be stuck at a kind of 14-year-old understanding is not something to be proud of. It wouldn't be something to be proud of if you rejected science based on what you understood of it when you were 14 or anything else.
I suppose it can be helpful, and the pilgrimage project is very good for this, to realize that one can engage with Christian culture and with Christian practices and Christian arts, etc., without necessarily having to sign up to A, B, C, D, E. You don't have to completely believe everything in the Nicene Creed to still to engage with the culture.
No, that's exactly it, Jules. I think that the pilgrimage thing is completely open. I mean, one of the slogans of the British Pilgrimage Trust is open to all. And open to all means, on the one hand, open to everybody. And one of the things we're trying to do is encourage people from non-Christian and non-British backgrounds to do this, because most immigrants remain urban. I mean, they immigrate to cities, and if they think of the land, the nature, etc., it's their village in Jamaica or their village in India or their village in Africa or something. Right. They don't relate to the land of England. They don't. If you go walking in the countryside, everyone's white. Practically everyone's.
I think that's partly because there's a fear. I mean, I met someone in London. He'd never left his postcode. He only first went to central London out of his postcode when he was 14. And that's partly about safety. I think it's feeling like if I go to the countryside, they might be racist. I might not be welcome there. Yes.
Well, I think that's part of it. And anyway, what we're doing is some of the groups that my colleague Guy Hayward leads, the idea is to include everyone who wants to come. And you go, you feel safe, you're shown how to do it. You're shown that there are footpaths through the countryside in England. Most people don't know that if they've come from other countries. You can actually walk. So part of it is open to all, to lead people to connection with the land and its holy places and historic places without requiring them.
Because pilgrimage as a tradition exists all over the world, doesn't it? It is a multi.
Exactly, in every tradition. And so every religious tradition contains it. And so it's not as if it's a new idea or an alien idea to anyone from any culture, really. And also open to all in the sense that what are we open to? If you don't want to use the word God, then what would be the ultimate to which you could be open? Well, the all is a pretty good word for it. Whether you mean by the all the universe and the scientific laws and matter and energy and the fields that govern it, which would be a kind of materialist vision of the all, but it's still a very big vision. or the all, including the consciousness that is within and beyond nature. I mean, you can interpret the all as you like, but I think that's part of it. And the other slogan of the British Pilgrimage Trust is bring your own beliefs. Again, it's not about signing up to a belief system, it's about an experience.
Right.
And my own view of religion is that all religions start from experience. They're primarily about experience, not about beliefs. And in fact, if you look at people who go to church, although many of them will say the creed during the service, a lot have a very hazy understanding of the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, which is what the creed is about. They go to church because of the experience, the community singing together, taking part in rituals, receiving Holy Communion, observing the liturgical year, taking part in festivals, having rites of passage, baptisms, marriages and deaths, funerals. It's all about these experiences, lifestyle, community, connection, continuity, tradition, and linkage to holy places and local communities. It's not primarily, for most people who go to church, a detailed intellectual understanding of the theological doctrines.
Right, right. Well, it's wonderful to hear, and I wonder if do you have any kind of conversations ever with leaders of the Anglican Church? Do you think or do you just kind of do your own thing and support do they appreciate things like the work with pilgrimages, or do they appreciate you as someone who can probably take Christian ideas to places that really they rarely go, as into New Age spirituality and that kind of community?
Well, yes, I do. I mean, the British Pilgrimage Trust, for example, we're now working closely with the Association of English Cathedrals and cathedral deans, and we're working with them on these day-long pilgrimage routes. They love the idea. And some of the deans have now started mapping out the routes themselves and walking these routes and developing them. We're working with them. They're not against it at all. They love it. And we suggested, Guy Hayward gave a workshop at the English Cathedrals Conference a couple of years ago. One of the ideas we've been doing is making visiting holy places much more immersive. And one practice is simply lying on the floor. And if you lie on the floor in a cathedral, you look up at the vaulting and the stained glass windows from lying down. It's a completely different, much more immersive experience.
Right.
And they asked him, the deans and people at this workshop he gave at the cathedral conference, if he had any suggestions. And he mentioned this as one of the things that we're interested in. We'd been doing it surreptitiously, when no one's looking, lying on the floor. But within a few months, one of the cathedrals, Lincoln Cathedral, started a whole new program. They're probably thinking about it anyway, called Sacred Space, which they were running till the shutdown. Once a month. You go on in the evening to the cathedral at 7:30. There's no formal service going on. You're invited into the sacred space. And for the very first one, they invited Guy to go to it. When he arrived, the precentor, who was in charge of the services and the music, was handing out yoga mats, and people were invited to lie down in the cathedral and experience the space in quiet, open for an hour, just to experience the space. So far from opposition to these ideas, we found, people it's wonderful. I've worked with many kinds of institutions, and whenever I suggest ideas for reform or new ideas, I'm always having new ideas. I'm usually met with sort of indifference, rejection, too much trouble, not the right time for this, etc. Working with cathedrals and churches on this pilgrimage project is the exact opposite. I've never met. It's pushing at an open door. It's a wonderful cooperative effort at the moment.
Very good.
So I've been very impressed by the level of leadership in the Anglican Church. And if you look on my website, you'll see I've had a whole series of dialogues on just the kind of things we're talking about with Mark Andrus, who's a friend of mine. He's also Bishop of California at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. And if you want to hear what it's like talking to a Californian Anglican who's at the leading edge of what's happening today, you could listen to some of those dialogues, and you'll see that we're not talking here about somebody who's stuffily embedded in an archaic view or a 19th century view, but someone who's talking in the same language that you and I are, and yet who's in charge of a whole diocese, which includes Silicon Valley, at a wonderful cathedral at the very heart of San Francisco, which had a long history of interaction with Esalen, and with every Tuesday is yoga day in Grace Cathedral, and more than 1,000 people go and do yoga, take their mats, do yoga in the cathedral.
Wow. Well, that would be fascinating. I hadn't heard of him or of the cathedral, but absolutely I will go and listen to that. Thank you. Well,
and my dialogues with Matthew Fox. I've written 2 books with him, and he's. We've also a whole series of dialogues with him on the internet. He's an Episcopal priest. He used to be Roman Catholic. He's now an Anglican priest. So here are 2 people. Oh, and then Mark Vernon, of course, who's an Anglican, and who we've now done, I think, 56 dialogues, which are exploring the kind of areas we're talking about now.
So you've done a lot of kind of being in a relationship with the church and in dialogue with its representatives for many years now.
Oh, many years. I mean, after all, Father Bede Griffiths was a Roman Catholic priest and Benedictine monk, and we talked every single day, and he was so it's a long running dialogue. So I've found it a very helpful dialogue, and I've never felt inhibited or suppressed or constricted by dogma in my conversations with these religious figures, or including conversations with Sufis and with Hindus and Buddhists. Whereas the minute I enter a scientific institution or laboratory, I feel the shutters come down almost instantly, and the narrowness of the permissible discussion is frighteningly narrow, and people are terrified of saying anything that might make them seem heretical, even if privately they have much broader views. So in my experience, I mean, I don't live in Texas, and I'm not associating with Southern Baptists, but in my experience, the world of science is much more dogmatic than the world of religion today. Maybe 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 300 years ago, it was the other way around. That's the way most people imagine it still is, but I don't think that's the case anymore.
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you so much for your time. I've learned a lot, and you've given me lots of leads to go and read about and listen to, so I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Good. I hope it's helpful. And all the best with your project. It's a very, very important topic.
Yeah, thank you.